Lila was a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She lived in a small wooden house at the edge of a quiet village. Her father had once been a kind and hard-working man, and when he was alive, their home was full of laughter and warmth. Every morning, he would make her porridge and tell her stories about the world outside their little village. Lila used to dream of traveling, seeing big cities, meeting kind people, and living a life filled with love and respect. But all of that changed when her father passed away. Lila was still a teenager at that time, too young to fully understand what was happening. She was left with her stepmother and two stepbrothers. From that day on, the bright light in her life began to fade. The house that once felt like home now felt like a cage. Her stepmother was not cruel in loud ways, but in quiet, cold ways that hurt even more. She rarely spoke kindly to Lila. She would look at her as if she were just a burden, someone who didn't belong. Every day, Lila was forced to do all the housework. She woke up before the sun rose, swept the floor, washed the dishes, cooked meals, and even carried heavy buckets of water from the nearby well. Her stepbrothers did not help her. They spent their days playing games, wandering around the village, and talking big about dreams they never worked for. They would laugh and eat while Lila stood quietly in the corner, tired and hungry. If something went wrong in the house, even if it was not her fault, Lila was the one who was blamed. She learned not to talk back, not to cry too loud, not to expect kindness. The villagers often saw her carrying wood or walking with a basket on her head. Some pitied her, some ignored her, and some whispered behind her back. But Lila kept walking with her head down and her heart quiet. She believed that maybe, someday, life would give her a small piece of kindness again. The stepmother had once imagined a better life too. She had married Lila's father not only for love but also for security. But when he passed, the small savings were slowly used up. The farm was not giving much, and debts started growing like weeds. She became worried, then angry, and finally cold. She began to look at Lila not as a human, but as a problem that needed a solution. One evening, after the sun had set and the room was dimly lit by a single lamp, the stepmother sat at the old kitchen table. The two stepbrothers sat beside her. They had spent most of the day gambling with a few coins they had managed to get, hoping to double their money. But they lost everything. Now they were frustrated. "She's just sitting here," one of the brothers said, pointing at Lila, who was quietly washing the last dish of the night. "She doesn't bring anything into this house. She only eats and works." Lila heard the words, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that speaking would only make things worse. The stepmother stared at her for a long moment, her eyes thoughtful. "She is young," she finally said slowly. "There must be some use for her." The second brother laughed lightly, not fully understanding what his mother meant. But as she spoke further, her voice became clearer, and so did her plan. "We can't keep feeding her," she said. "We need money. Even a little will help us get through the next few days. If someone wants her, maybe they will pay." The words felt like sharp wind in the air. The older brother leaned closer. "Who would pay for her?" he asked. "There are people," the stepmother replied. "People who want someone to work for them. Someone who can clean, cook, or help with their house. She's young and healthy. $5 will be enough. That can buy us food and wood for a week, $5. That was all they thought she was worth. Lila's hands trembled in the water. She kept her eyes on the dish, pretending she hadn't heard. But every word sank deep into her heart. She wasn't being treated as a daughter, not even as a human being. She was just something to be sold. That night, Lila lay on her thin mattress in the small corner of the house. Her room had no door, only a curtain. The wind came in through the cracks in the walls. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around her and stared at the roof. Her chest felt heavy, but not because she was surprised. She had known for a long time that her stepmother did not love her. But she had never imagined that they would try to give her away for a few coins. She thought about her father and the promises he had made. "You'll never be alone," he used to say. "You'll always be safe." She closed her eyes and whispered those words to herself like a prayer. The next morning, everything felt colder. The stepmother told her to wear her only decent dress. It was a plain blue dress that her father had bought for her many years ago. It no longer fit her perfectly, but it was all she had. She brushed her long black hair and tied it neatly. She didn't understand why she was being told to look nice, but deep down she already knew. By afternoon, people in the village had heard the news. A poor family at the edge of town was looking to sell a young girl for $5. Some whispered in shock, some just shook their heads, but nobody came forward to stop it. Lila felt like the world had turned its back on her. She stood quietly near the wooden fence of the house while her stepmother spoke to a group of curious men and women. They looked at Lila not with kindness, but with the same cold curiosity one would use when examining an object for sale. Lila lowered her eyes, her hands folded in front of her, her heart beating fast. The older brother laughed as he leaned against the wall. "Someone will take her," he said to a neighbor. "She's strong. She can clean and cook. She doesn't talk much either. Perfect for someone who needs a helper." Lila wanted to run away, but she had nowhere to go. The world outside the village was unknown to her. She had no money, no friends, no one to trust, so she stayed still like a tree standing in a storm. Hours passed. Some people came and went. Some offered less than $5. Some just looked and left. Each passing minute felt heavier than the last. As the sun slowly dipped lower in the sky, Lila's stepmother grew impatient. "Someone will come," she said firmly, as if she were trying to convince herself as well. "They will come." Lila stood silently. Her feet ached, but she didn't move. Her mind wandered to memories she had tried to protect deep inside. She remembered her father's laughter, the smell of porridge in the morning, the little stories he used to tell. She held on to those memories tightly, like a candle in the dark. That evening, as the last rays of the sun colored the sky orange and gold, a tall man on a dark horse passed by the road. He wore a long coat and a hat. He was known by some in the village but spoken about in whispers. He lived far away from the crowded streets in a big house near the river. His name was Edward. Edward had lived alone for years. He had wealth, but his house was silent. Some said he preferred it that way. Others said he carried old memories he did not share with anyone. He rarely came into the village, and when he did, people looked at him with quiet curiosity. When he heard the whispers about the girl being sold for $5, something in his heart shifted. It was not pity. It was something deeper, something quiet but strong. He slowed his horse and looked toward the small house where Lila stood. He saw a thin young woman in a blue dress standing quietly near a wooden fence, her head bowed, her hands tightly folded together. She did not beg, she did not cry, she did not shout. She only stood like a flower growing in a field where no one cared to water it. Edward's eyes softened. He had seen pain before, but something about this girl's quiet strength touched him deeply. Inside the house, the stepmother saw him approaching and straightened her back quickly. "See?" she whispered to her sons. "Someone important is coming." Lila did not lift her eyes, but she felt the change in the air. She heard the sound of hooves stop. She felt many eyes turn toward the man. Her heart beat faster, not with hope but with fear of the unknown. Edward slowly got down from his horse and walked toward the stepmother. The crowd fell silent. The stepmother forced a smile and began to speak, hoping to sound polite. "She can work," she said quickly. "She's strong, quiet, and does not cause trouble. Just $5. That's all we ask." Edward did not reply immediately. His eyes moved to Lila. She still did not look up, but he could see the way her hands trembled slightly. He understood in that silent moment that this was not just a transaction. This was a life. The stepmother waited for an answer. The two brothers exchanged greedy looks, and the villagers watched with wide eyes. The sun disappeared slowly behind the trees, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and purple, and in the stillness of that evening, something unexpected began to unfold, something that neither Lila nor anyone else had imagined that day. Edward stood still in front of the small house, the fading evening light shining softly on his face. His eyes remained on Lila, who kept her head down and her hands folded tightly together. There was something about the quiet way she stood that made his heart ache in a way he could not explain. He had seen many people in his life, some loud, some proud, but she was different. She was silent, yet her silence spoke more than any words could. The stepmother was the first to break the silence. She cleared her throat and gave a nervous smile. "She is strong," she said again, her voice quick and eager. "She can work all day. She doesn't talk back. You won't have any trouble with her. $5. That is all we ask." Edward did not look at her. His eyes stayed on Lila. "Does she have a name?" he asked quietly. The stepmother blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected that question. "Lila," she finally said. Edward nodded slowly. Then he turned back to the woman. $5, he repeated, his voice calm but firm. The two brothers exchanged quick looks. They could already imagine the food and drink they would buy with the money. The stepmother reached out her hand quickly, eager to make the trade. Edward pulled out the $5 from inside his coat and placed it on the small wooden table near the fence. But before she could speak further, he turned to Lila. "You're coming with me," he said softly. For a moment, Lila didn't move. She wasn't sure if she should believe what she heard. All her life, no one had ever asked her what she wanted. She had never been given a choice. She looked at the stepmother, who only nodded with a greedy smile, and then at Edward, whose face was serious but not unkind. She lowered her eyes again and slowly walked forward. Edward held out his hand to help her climb onto the horse. She hesitated. She had never ridden a horse before, but when his steady hand supported hers, something inside her felt strangely safe. She climbed on carefully and sat behind him. The stepmother grabbed the money and waved her hand as if Lila were a piece of old cloth she no longer needed. "Goodbye," she said simply. There was no warmth in her voice. As the horse began to move, the village slowly disappeared behind them. The sound of the wheels on the dirt road faded, replaced by the soft rhythm of hooves. Lila looked back once. She saw the small house where she had spent so many years of pain and silence. For the first time, she did not feel the weight of its walls. She felt the wind on her face, soft and free. Edward didn't say much on the way. He didn't ask her questions, and he didn't speak about himself. But there was something in his silence that felt different from the silence of her stepfamily. His silence was calm, not cold. Safe, not cruel. They rode for a long time, passing through tall trees and open fields. The moon began to rise, painting the night sky in silver light. For Lila, the world outside the village had always been a dream she never thought she would see. Now she was living it, and every step of the horse felt like a step away from her old life. Finally, they reached a large iron gate. Beyond it stood a big house surrounded by tall trees and a quiet river flowing nearby. The house looked old but strong, with warm lights glowing softly through the windows. Edward got down first and then helped Lila carefully step off the horse. "This is my home," he said gently. Lila stood still, unsure how to act. She had never been in a place like this. She looked at the house with wide eyes. It was silent, but not in a lonely way. It felt peaceful. A kind old woman opened the door and came out. She was Edward's housekeeper. She had worked there for many years and treated him like her own son. When she saw Lila, she looked a little surprised but did not ask many questions. Edward spoke to her quietly, and she nodded with understanding. "Come inside," the housekeeper said kindly to Lila. "You must be tired." Lila stepped inside slowly. The warmth of the house wrapped around her like a blanket. There was a soft fire in the fireplace, a clean wooden floor, and the faint smell of freshly baked bread. It was unlike anything she had known. The housekeeper gave her a warm bowl of soup and a piece of soft bread. Lila held the spoon carefully, almost afraid it wasn't real. She couldn't remember the last time someone had handed her food with kindness. She took a small bite, and tears slowly filled her eyes. Not because the soup was fancy, but because it was warm, gentle, and given with care. Edward watched quietly from the corner. He didn't want to make her uncomfortable. He could see how carefully she moved, how she waited before every small action as if she expected someone to shout at her. He understood. He had been through his own lonely years too. He didn't speak much, but his eyes carried the weight of memories he never shared. The housekeeper showed Lila to a small but clean room. There was a soft bed with a warm blanket and a window that opened toward the river. When she touched the blanket, she almost didn't believe it. It felt too soft, too kind for someone like her. "You can rest," the housekeeper said gently. "No one will trouble you here." That night, Lila lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The room was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the cold silence of her stepfamily's house, but a peaceful one. She closed her eyes and whispered a thank you she wasn't sure anyone could hear. The next morning, sunlight gently entered the room. Birds were singing outside. Lila woke up slowly, not to the sound of angry voices, but to the sound of calm. She walked to the window and watched the river shining under the early sun. She found the housekeeper in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Edward was already sitting at the table reading a book. When he saw her, he gave a small nod. "Good morning," he said simply. Lila lowered her eyes and whispered back, "Good morning." "You don't have to work here unless you want to," Edward said gently. You're not a servant. You're free. Lila's heart trembled at the word free. No one had ever said that to her before. She didn't even know what freedom felt like. She had spent her whole life working for people who never thanked her. Now someone was offering her something she couldn't fully understand yet. Days turned into weeks. Lila slowly learned to live without fear. She helped in the kitchen, tended to the flowers in the garden, and walked near the river every evening. She began to smile again, quietly at first, then a little more each day. Edward noticed these small changes. He didn't force her to talk, but sometimes they sat together in the garden, listening to the river and the wind. He told her stories of the world he had seen when he was younger. Lila listened like a child listening to fairy tales, each story opening a window to a bigger world. The villagers who had once ignored her began to whisper again, but this time with curiosity. The poor girl is living in the big house now, they said. Some were surprised, some were curious, and some even jealous, but Lila didn't care anymore. For the first time, she had a life of her own. She learned that Edward had once loved someone deeply but had lost her long ago. Since then, he had chosen to live alone, away from everyone, but when he saw Lila, something in his heart had remembered what it felt like to care again. He didn't see her as a burden or a responsibility. He simply saw her as a human being who deserved better. One rainy afternoon, Lila sat by the window watching raindrops slide down the glass. Edward entered the room quietly and stood beside her. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "You don't owe me anything." Lila looked at him. I don't have anything to give," she whispered. Edward smiled gently. Kindness doesn't ask for anything in return. That moment became a turning point in Lila's heart. She realized that not all people in the world were like her stepfamily. There were kind souls too, people who helped not because they wanted something but because they simply cared. Seasons passed. Spring brought flowers, summer brought warm evenings, and autumn painted the leaves gold. Lila grew stronger, not just in body but in spirit. She started reading, learning, and dreaming again. She no longer walked with her head down. Edward, too, changed in quiet ways. The silence in his house was no longer heavy. It was warm. He found himself smiling more often, listening to Lila talk about the little things she loved, the way the river sounded in the morning, the way flowers opened under the sun, the way stars looked brighter in the night sky. One evening, they walked together by the river. The air was cool and the sky was full of stars. Lila stopped and looked at the reflection of the moon on the water. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "that life can surprise us when we least expect it?" Edward looked at her and nodded. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes the most unexpected moments bring the most beautiful changes." Lila smiled gently. She wasn't the same girl who once stood silently by the fence, waiting to be sold for $5. She was stronger now, free. And though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for sure. She would never let anyone make her feel small again. Her story was no longer one of pain and silence. It had become a story of kindness, hope, and second chances. And as the night wrapped around them, the lonely house by the river was lonely no more. Two souls who had once carried quiet pain had found light in each other's company, not out of obligation but out of something simple and pure: kindness.